Good morning. This is a small lecture for Bio 2010, Cell Biology and Biochemistry, being offered at Point Loma Nazarene University. This comes from section 1.3 of our textbook, which again is Biology, Principles of Biology by Brooker et al. And I will be highlighting sections 1.3 of our textbook, which is Biology as a Scientific Discipline. We'll be differentiating between discovery-based science and hypothesis-driven science, and talk a little bit about the difference between a hypothesis and a theory. To begin, we should discuss what exactly is science. We say that science is not only a body of knowledge, which it most certainly is, but it's also a process of inquiry, an agreed upon approach to how to study this particular discipline. Your textbook defines science as the observation, identification, experimental investigation, and theoretical explanation of natural phenomena. So as we are looking at science, there are two main approaches to this discipline. The first is something known as discovery-based science, and the other is hypothesis testing. So let's differentiate between the two. Discovery science is when observations and measurements of the natural world take place apart from any type of experimental manipulation. So this is purely exploratory, and really what you're doing is you're asking what questions. This is not answering how or why questions, which are more mechanistic in nature. So for example, what new medicines can we find in the rainforest? What happens to a particular fish population in an estuary during changes in the tide? What types of bacteria inhabit this contaminated groundwater? Again, we are asking what questions, not how or why. So for instance, with regards to the first what question, what new medicines can we find in rainforest plants? What we are not doing is answering how and why questions. For instance, how do these medicines actually cure a particular illness? How are they activating certain target genes to ameliorate symptoms, etc.? That is not discovery-based science. Discovery-based science is merely finding out what new medicines can we find in the rainforest, not explaining their mechanism of action. Now, this is in contrast to hypothesis-driven science, which is the hypothetico-deductive method, or more commonly referred to as the scientific method. Here we are answering those how questions. How do the medicines work? How are they activating certain target genes? That would be hypothesis-driven science. So here what we're doing is we're making observations and measurements of experimentally manipulated subjects. Oftentimes, your discovery-based science will lead to hypothesis testing. So what is this agreed upon process of inquiry? Well, we start the scientific method with an observation. So again, this could come from discovery science, or it could come from an experiment that's already been run. So an observation is made, and then that will lead to a hypothesis, which is an educated guess or an explanation of that particular observation. Now, a well-formulated hypothesis will lead to experimentation and prediction. So here you will design your experiment, and if your hypothesis is written well, then you actually can predict what your experiment should look like and how it should turn out. That will then lead to the actual running of the experiment where you will collect your data or your results. At that point, you'll analyze the data, and sometimes it will confer and agree with your hypothesis, and other times it won't. So at that point, you can draw conclusions, and you say either your hypothesis was supported or refuted. Sometimes we'll say accepted or rejected. What we don't do is we do not say that we have proven our hypothesis to be true. We don't use that terminology in science because it could be a limitation due to our instrumentation or something we're not thinking about. So we use these terms support and accept, or refute and reject, but we don't ever say prove. All right, so let's put this into practice. Science, as we said, is going to start off with an interesting observation. So here you see a beautiful maple tree. This is in the fall. And what you'll observe is that there are leaves on the ground that are starting to collect around this tree. So we have made the observation, maple leaves lose their leaves in the fall. So as we said, an observation with hypothesis-driven science will lead to a hypothesis, which is, again, an educated guess or an explanation. So based upon our observation, which is maple leaves lose their leaves in the fall, we can actually come up with a whole series of hypotheses. Maybe this is due to the amount of sunlight. Maybe this is due to nutrient depletion. Maybe this is due to a change in the temperature. So there's lots of different hypotheses that we could come to based upon our observation. But you need to go ahead and commit and pick one. So we will go with this hypothesis that cool nights are what cause the leaves on trees to fall off. Now, a couple of key things when you're formulating your hypothesis is that these need to be strong statements. You have to have a hypothesis that's actually testable. So it's going to have a material nature to it. It cannot be looking at the supernatural. You can't say, it's God who determined this tree had to shed its leaves. We actually can't test that scientifically. It will have to be something that you can evaluate the hypothesis through observation and experimentation. So the hypothesis has to be testable, but it also has to be falsifiable. It has to have some way that you can actually prove that it's false. You can't formulate a hypothesis which cannot be disproven. So again, these are our two criteria. Is it testable? And is there a possibility that it's wrong, that it's falsifiable? So again, our observation was that these maple trees lose their leaves in the fall. Our hypothesis was that the cool nights cause the leaves on the trees to fall off. So again, we need to look at our hypothesis. Is it testable and is it falsifiable? Indeed, it is. It's testable. We can set up an experiment where we look at the temperature implications on a tree and whether or not that causes leaves to fall off. Is it falsifiable? Yes, it is. Maybe it is not temperature that is causing the leaves on the trees to fall off. And if we set up an experiment appropriately, we would actually be able to see that. So it's a testable and it's falsifiable. So this would be a good hypothesis. Now, if you've written your hypothesis appropriately, that will lead to experimentation and prediction. This is where you're able to test your hypothesis and actually predict the outcome of your experiment. So with regards to our hypothesis, what does this look like with regards to experimentation? As we are designing our experiment, we are going to need to keep in mind several key variables. The first are controlled variables. These are conditions that potentially could vary, but we are going to try to keep everything constant that we can as far as humanly possible such that it won't impact our outcome. So for instance, if we are going to be looking purely at the impact of cool nights causing leaves to fall off of trees, we are going to be wanting to test 2 different maple trees in completely identical environments with the exception of the temperature at night. So potentially what we could do is set up in greenhouses, a whole set of maple trees growing in each greenhouse. We want to be looking at the exact same type of maple tree, say for instance a Japanese maple tree. We want to be looking at utilizing the same nutrients in the soil, the same type of soil, the same amount of water each day, the same amount of sun exposure. You want to keep everything the same with the exception that at night The one greenhouse is going to be much cooler than the other one. So those would be our controlled variables: the soil, the trees, the temperature during the day, the sunlight, etc. Now, if I were to ask you what is the independent variable, this is the variable that you are manipulating in the experiment. The way I always remember independent variable is the I in independent. I vary the independent variable. So what am I varying? I am varying the temperature at night. So that is my independent variable. Whereas the dependent variable is the thing that we're measuring. What are we actually measuring in this experiment? Well, every day as a scientist, you'd be going in the greenhouse and you would be collecting the leaves that have fallen off the trees, and you would be counting the leaves. That is what's actually being measured. So the independent variable, I vary the independent variable, again, is the temperature in the greenhouses at night. The dependent variable, the thing that I'm measuring, are the number of leaves that have fallen off the trees. As far as possible, it's important to include positive controls and negative controls as well. So for our particular experiment, an excellent positive control would be to utilize nighttime temperatures where we know leaves are falling off of trees. So wherever the particular maple tree is that comes from that we're looking at, and we know that leaves are falling off the trees, we need to utilize that evening temperature to mimic the natural environment where those leaves are naturally falling off. Now, some experiments are going to be easier to generate your negative control or your positive control, and we'll talk about this extensively in lab. One more important idea to talk about is the null hypothesis. And the null hypothesis is going to come into play when we're talking about statistics. Again, we'll go over statistics extensively in lab, but the null hypothesis states that there's actually no significant difference between the control and the test group. And so when we are running things like t-tests, what we're looking at is whether or not the null hypothesis is supported or not. And we will again explain this in more detail, but I want you to start to get into the habit of defining for each of your experiments what is the null hypothesis. So again, our hypothesis is that the change in temperature to colder nights is what causes the leaves to fall off trees. So the null hypothesis would argue that the change in temperature to colder nights does not cause the leaves to fall off in the autumn. If we're looking at our two different greenhouses where we've maintained everything the same and all that we're changing is the nighttime temperatures, and we don't see any difference in the number of leaves that have fallen off the trees, then we know that the null hypothesis was supported, that there is no difference. So if you have made an appropriate hypothesis and designed your experiments with all the correct controls, that will then allow you to make a whole series of predictions. So one potential prediction that we could make is if we actually kept the temperatures the same in our two greenhouses, that would result in the leaves not falling off the trees. If we didn't ever lower the temperature to those much colder temps in the one greenhouse, the leaves shouldn't fall off. So again, if you have made a good and strong hypothesis that's testable and falsifiable, if you've designed your experiment appropriately, where you have kept everything controlled with the exception of the one variable that you are altering, which is your independent variable, you can then make a whole host of predictions based upon your hypothesis. So for us, our prediction for our experiment would be the following. If cool nights do cause the leaves to fall off, and if we had two groups of trees that are kept in similar environments, but one group is kept at a constant temperature while the other is brought to lower fall-like temperatures in the evening, then the leaves will only fall off of the second group of trees. That would be our prediction for our particular experiment. So again, your observations have led to your hypothesis. Your hypothesis has led to your experiments, which you can actually predict what the results will be. So now it's time to actually run the experiment, at which point we're going to be collecting our data and observing our results. Because we are able to predict our results, we will know whether or not our hypothesis is going to be supported or rejected. So if what we predict comes to fruition, then we would say, okay, our hypothesis was indeed supported. Or if your prediction proves to be incorrect, you would say, my hypothesis is rejected, and then you would formulate a new hypothesis. Sometimes it will also reveal if you've got some experimental design flaws, and you can go ahead and tweak your experiment. All right, so let's go ahead and look at our hypothesis again. Cold temperatures in autumn cause the leaves to fall off of trees. So what is the independent variable? The independent variable is temperature. So we are going to be varying the temperature in these two greenhouses. We have controlled for as many things as we possibly can. We've put the same types of trees into these two greenhouses. We have put the same type of soil, the same amount of water, the same amount of sunlight. The only thing that we are going to vary is the temperature in the one greenhouse, and so we're going to make it more fall-like and lower those temperatures and see if that causes the predicted leaves to fall off of the trees. Now let's assume that we obtained the following data looking at our control group versus our experimental group. So here we would say that the number of leaves did not vary between the two groups. So in this particular situation, we would actually have to reject our hypothesis. Our hypothesis was not supported based upon the data that we obtained. So on the other hand, what if we got these results? Okay, so there looks to be maybe a slight difference between our experimental group and our control group, but it doesn't appear to be significant. So again, we would have to reject our hypothesis. So once you reject your hypothesis, you need to come up with some alternative hypotheses and look at other ways to test them. Okay, so it's not the cold temperature that's causing the leaves to fall off of trees. What are some other things that could cause leaves to fall off trees? So what if we thought, okay, that didn't work. Let's look at the amount of daylight. So we know in the fall that there's less daylight. Maybe that's what's actually inducing the leaves to fall off of the trees. So now we have, again, our two greenhouses. We control for as many things as we can. We actually will keep the temperature the same, but now instead we're going to alter the amount of light exposure between these two greenhouses. So we're going to have, for the greenhouse on the left, the amount of light exposure is going to be constant for 200 days, whereas the greenhouse on the right, we're going to have progressively shorter amount of sunlight for 200 days. Now let's assume we obtain the following results. Here we've got our control group, our experimental group. The thing we are measuring again are the number of leaves that are falling off the trees. You can see that here on our y-axis, our dependent variable, whereas what we are varying is the amount of light is here on the x-axis. And what we can see is this looks to be significantly different. And so now we say our hypothesis is indeed accepted. One thing we'll be teaching you how to do in lab is how to run statistical analysis on this type of data to determine whether or not it is statistically significant or not. All right, so again, once we've made our predictions, that leads to us to actually be able to either support or refute our hypothesis. However, we do not say that we've ever proven it to be true. At this point, all we've done is merely supported our hypothesis. You want to be careful in how you use that terminology. All right, so in summary, we've looked at how an observation can lead to a hypothesis, that a hypothesis by definition needs to be testable and falsifiable, how that then leads to experimentation with all the appropriate controls, and that a good experiment can allow you to actually predict your results, which will either support or refute your hypothesis. You then run the actual experiment, collect your data, and analyze it. At that point, you can say whether or not you've been able to accept or reject your hypothesis. The last thing I want to highlight is just the difference between a hypothesis and a theory. Sometimes the way we use these terms in our common exchange is different than how we would use them in science. We've thoroughly talked about what a hypothesis is, so I just want to highlight exactly in science how we define a theory, which is a broad explanation of some aspect of the natural world. And this is going to be substantiated by a large body of evidence. For instance, many different disciplines will support this same theory. You might have mathematical support, physics, chemistry, biology. They're all going to be coming to the same conclusion. It's really an established set of ideas that explains a vast amount of data and offers valid predictions that can be and have been tested. Now, this is in contrast to how we use the term theory. For instance, I had a theory growing up about musicals. So I grew up watching The Sound of Music from the time I was young. It was a big part of my childhood and my positive family memories. And so I had a theory that if we just would sing our way through the day, that we would all be infinitely happier. This was further supported by numerous musicals, including such recent ones as La La Land, which would argue that even being stuck in a traffic jam could be pure joy. Okay, so this is a theory. This is merely Wolbern's theory. This is not a scientific theory. It is not supported by chemistry and biology and physics and mathematics. Again, theory in science is a broad explanation of some aspect of the natural world. So just make sure that when you're using these terms, hypothesis and theory, that you are differentiating how they're used in our common language as opposed to how they are used in the scientific world. All right, I hope that was helpful.